All right, so let's get going here. That final kind of assignment was due at the end of the day today. If you haven't done the first 5, it's good to say I'm going to drop the lowest one. So if you did the first 5, you don't have to worry about this. It could be an additional kind of practice resource. So similar to the last exam, I put the 2 homeworks back up there and kind of labeled them practice, not on Canvas, but on the actual kind of My Econ Lab website. So if you want to go back through and review those homework assignments, you have those 2 versions that are just going to be open the rest of this week. The other ones are closed, so I don't want to like treat it as though it's like a new submission or anything. So it's exact same problems, but just set as practice. So that'd be good to kind of review those. I would start out though making sure that you're kind of comfortable and are able to answer and understand why the answer is what it is for that practice problems 5 and practice problems 6 kind of documents that are up there on Canvas under files and final exam materials. Okay. So the practice problems for 6, I have pretty detailed answers up there just in case people want to start studying early. We worked through all of practice problems 5 on Friday, with the exception of the very last kind of short answer one. I'm not going to expect you to kind of create your own normal form game. So if we have time today, I'll kind of go through that. Otherwise, I'll get up a kind of scanned version of how you would create that normal form game and then solve it for that last problem in practice problems 5. But unless I have kind of specific questions over things today, we'll probably mainly focus on that practice problem 6 file. Okay. So our exam, as stated on the syllabus, and let's see if I can remember, I think this class should be Wednesday at noon. So if we look at the syllabus, you can kind of scroll all the way once it loads. Maybe I'll have to download it here. Guess we're gonna have to download it. So you scroll all the way down at the bottom, kind of Wednesday at noon, and that's gonna be here in class, okay? So we'll meet here at noon on Wednesday, of 2 hours. So what the other exams we had in class about an hour, about 25 questions. So I should give you a 50 question exam. Right? No, I won't do that. So I'll have 2 hours, but it's only going to be, and I actually have it kind of already printed off. It's actually just under 30 questions, right? So I did 5 multiple choice and then 5 true or false, and then 23 multiple choice. The total points is a little bit over 100. So if you got everything right, I think you actually get like a 102.5 out of 100. So there's like 2.5 additional points there, kind of give you a little bit of a kind of almost built-in curve, I guess, so to speak. And then, it's kind of similar to the last ones. Like you'll have paper you can work on, you can write in the exam. Other than that, are there any kind of logistical questions for me regarding the exam? Okay. So it's kind of unlike the last one. We don't really have a formula sheet. I would say really the only type of math you might have to do in the formulas that you want to make sure you know would be the value of the marginal product of labor, which is just price times marginal product of labor. And then the other one that you might be expected to know is that if I'm calculating the marginal product per labor, that's just a change in output over a change in my quantity of labor. Okay, we'll go through an example where we use these today. Okay. Before we kind of start going through questions, just as kind of a general guide, I would say, make sure you know or understand examples where you have positive or negative externalities. So know how those would shift either kind of our marginal costs or our marginal benefit curves, thinking about marginal social benefits with positive externalities, marginal social costs with negative externalities. Know how to identify the kind of efficient point for society in both of those relative to the point where the free market arrives at. Know that for positive externalities, we can correct for those using subsidies. Negative externalities, we can correct for those using taxes, right? and kind of how those would like shift our private marginal benefit or marginal cost curves to match up with society's marginal benefits or marginal costs. From there, kind of go back and review, because I know the one class session where I kind of went over part of it as well was Thanksgiving break. So know those different types of goods. So we had public goods, private goods, natural monopolies, the goods that, I guess, natural monopoly goods, and then also common resources. So the way that those were all kind of differentiated from each other was these two features. So rival or excludable, and they could be, right, non-rival or non-excludable. So the idea of being rival was once this good is kind of used by one person, it is no longer available for anybody else. So if it was non-rival, that would mean that I can use it, but it doesn't, deplete the amount that's left for anyone else to use. This is the idea of I go use a public park and then I leave, the public park is exactly the same as, as long as I'm not, a devious member of society, right? It's going to be the same thing that someone else could then go use as well, right? Excludable is just basically the idea of pricing, right? If something is excludable, it means that I can prevent other people from using it. So if I buy a bottle of water, right, I have ownership to this and I can tell you, you can't have any of my water. Non-excludable would be something that is provided for everyone, right? So if you think about national defense, I can't exclude anyone from benefiting from that. Once it's paid for and it exists, we all enjoy the benefits, right? There's no way I can prevent you from enjoying the benefit, but still enjoy it for myself. So know how the different combinations of those things would kind of, for these four goods, know whether or not they're rival or excludable or non-rival or non-excludable. From there, we really kind of started hitting the labor market, right? So a couple things to know in the labor market that might not show up in practice problems. So know how to kind of think about unions and how those can change the market. We talked about monopsonies. Right? And then I would also kind of look back at our discussion on human capital, which is really just causing marginal productive labor differences among groups. Know how to identify equilibrium wages. I would also go back when we first introduced this idea, kind of review the minimum wage, and kind of how that works. And we'll work through some of these examples today, but I want to kind of give just a general roadmap of things that I would kind of make sure that you are feeling comfortable with. Okay. And that's by no means an exhaustive list, but this would be kind of the main themes here that I would focus on. Okay. Any questions, specific questions for me before I kind of jump into some problems here? Yeah. What is? Oh, rival or excludable. So this was think back to when we said there's a highway, right? So an uncongested highway would mean that me using it isn't detracting from the benefit that anyone else is getting, right? Because we're all going the speed limit, everything's fine. So we'd say, in a sense, that would be a non-rival good. As soon as it becomes congested, I can't spell, congested, we would say it's rival, right? So if a congested highway is then causing people to have to go slower, right, detracting from the benefit they get from using that highway, we would say that that's rival. So generally, we have private goods, which are rival, right? This would be anything that you really buy during the day, right? I don't know, think about any food thing, right? Once you buy it and it's consumed, no one else is consuming that, fast food burger or whatever it is. We also said that common resources, those are M's, those are also rival, right? So this is any natural resource like deer or coal or anything, right? Once someone uses that common resource, it's no longer there for anybody else. The kind of difference here was for a private good, whoever buys it has the rights to it. They can exclude other people from using it. However, for a common resource, whatever kind of stock of animal that's left out there, anybody, unless the government steps in and regulates it, anyone could really go use that common resource, right? So those two goods were rival, and what made them different was their excludability. And we didn't really talk a lot about natural monopoly goods. In fact, I wouldn't, wink, wink, worry about those too much for the exam because we didn't do that. Really, the other one we wanted to focus on was our public goods, which we said were non-rival. This was the idea of national defense, right, interstates, things like that, where they were non-rival, but also non-excludable. Okay, so we kind of focus on those three of the four. Does that get any question? Other questions before we kind of jump into a few problems here? All right, so I did post kind of the detailed answer key of these, but we'll kind of work through them. So that was practice problems 5. Let's go to 6, and let's go up here. Like, we didn't go over these last class, did we? Do you guys remember going through these? Someone nodded their head. No, okay. I think it was when I was writing out the answer key that I'm kind of remembering this. So let's say we had this table where it gives us the quantity of labor and how much that labor is producing, right? The quantity of jackets, some good. How would I calculate the marginal product of labor for the 8th worker here? So the marginal product of labor was just going to be our change in output divided by the change in the quantity of labor. So if I'm thinking about the 8th worker here, I've got, for whatever reason, when I'm hiring labor, I'm doing 2-unit jumps. So maybe this is some job that requires 2 individuals to kind of do it. So going from 6 to 8 workers, right? The marginal product of the 8th worker would be, well, how much did hiring those additional 2 workers change the output? So there, 60 to 50, that change in output was 10. Divided by, well, how many additional units of labor did I add? Well, I went from 6 to 8. So my marginal product of labor for that 8th worker would be 5, okay? And I could do this for every single quantity, right? So what might be useful on the exam for this next batch of questions is right next to it. Now I'm going to insert a row here, but you could have just written these down right next to it. Excuse me. Find the marginal product of labor for each one of these. So for the first one, well, there's no compare. We're just starting at 0. So then going from 0 to 16, right, the change was 16 divided by the change in labor, which was 2. So 8. Here, 16 to 36, the change was 20 divided by the change in labor, which was 2. So 10. Here it goes up by 14 divided by the change, which was 2. So 7. We already said this one was 5. Change was 8 divided by the change in labor, which was 2. So 8 over 2 is 4. And then here, the output changed by 6, labor changed by 2. So we have a marginal product of labor of 3. So I could do this for every single quantity of labor. And, you know, I will be nice generally and keep that quantity of labor, the change is kind of the same. So here they're always increasing by 2. Maybe on the exam, they increase by 3, or maybe they increase by 5, but I'll kind of keep that change in labor always consistent. Now, the change in output won't be, right? Because we know that we have what's true about labor as I hire more workers. Well, initially, I might get some specialization, right? So where would that show up in the table? When I went from 2 to 4 workers, my marginal productivity of labor actually increased. That might be a result of specialization, but over time, I know that the change in output or my marginal productivity of labor is going to decline or diminish. So I've got these marginal productive labors now. What's the value of the marginal productive labor of that 10th worker? So on the exam, I made sure to give you the information first, but 2 and 3 are really tied together, right? So I told you the price down here of jackets is $100, right? I'd likely on the exam give that to you like up here soon. So if that price of jackets is $100, Then to get the value of the marginal productivity of labor, well, I was writing this down earlier, the value of the marginal productivity of labor is just the price of the good times the marginal productivity of that worker. So when I'm looking at the 10th worker, well, we already found their marginal productivity of labor, which is 4. So to get the value, it would just be 4 times the price of that good, right? So the price of the good is $100. The marginal productivity of labor is 4. So the value of that marginal productivity of labor would be $400, right? Essentially, they're bringing in an additional $400 of revenue to this firm. Any questions over either of those before we keep moving? So similar sort of thing, right next to my marginal productivity of labor, I could also do a column where I find the value of the marginal productivity of labor. All I'm going to do there is take the values I calculate over here and multiply them by the price of the good. Right? So here, this is an easy one. I try to make the math kind of easy on these. So just multiplying by 100. So just adding 2 zeros basically to everything. Okay? So once I have that, I could be asked a question, which is, let's assume that the wage for these workers is $500. What's the optimal number of workers for the above firm to hire? So even though kind of, this is the value of this marginal productivity is in terms of like 1 unit of labor, right? So when we divided by that change in labor, that kind of made the value of the marginal productivity labor like 1 additional unit of labor. So firms will decide to hire workers as long as that value of the marginal productivity of labor is greater than the wage. Right? So if our wage is 500, greater than or equal to, I'm basically going to go through and say, okay, as long as the value of the marginal productivity of labor is greater than or equal to 500, we'll hire those workers. So I go here, will I hire those first 2 workers? Well, yeah, they're both adding $800 relative to the wage of 500. So yes, 1,000 is still greater than 500. 700 is greater than 500. 500 is exactly equal to. So we would say we kind of be indifferent at this point, but we will continue to hire as long as that value of the marginal productive labor is greater than or equal to the wage. So yes, we'll hire the 8th worker. Do we hire the 9th and 10th? Well, their value of marginal productive labor is a little bit lower than the wage. So we'd actually be paying for more than we're getting in return. So we wouldn't hire that 10th worker. We kind of stop there at the 8th. Okay? So that'd be B here, I guess. So I can guarantee you, you will see 3 problems very similar to these on the exam. Right? So I would know how to kind of go through, calculate that marginal productivity labor, turn it into value by just simply multiplying by the price of the good. And then as long as that value of the marginal productivity labor is greater than the wage, you would hire those workers, right? And then as soon as it's not, that's where you would say, I won't hire them. And you'll kind of know what the equilibrium number of workers would be there given that current wage, okay? Any questions on that? Okay. So suppose instead that we've got demand increasing for a firm's product and the firm is in a perfectly competitive market. Excuse me. The wages paid to the workers in the industry will blank and the equilibrium quantity of labor in that industry will blank. So here is an example where we were trying to tie together both the product and the labor market. Right? So how are those 2 things tied together? Well, the price of the good determined the value of the marginal productivity of labor, which we said is really just going to represent the demand curve for labor. Because firms would be willing to pay up to whatever value that worker is going to add to the company. So when I'm thinking about an increase in the demand for a specific product, this is where, even though the exam is not cumulative, we have to have some, everything builds on each other. So if demand increases, the equilibrium price of the good also increased. So if the price of the good increased, what happens to the demand curve for labor? Well, in the labor market, we had some demand curve for labor, some supply curve. We saw an increase in the price of the good, which increased the demand for labor, which consequently also increased the wage that we would pay that worker. Because now the products that our workers are producing are more valuable, right? So we would see kind of this increase in the demand for labor. Any questions on that? Oh, I think, and that was half the problem, right? We saw a wage increase and we saw the number of workers. Actually, I should call this demand curve too. We saw the quantity of workers also increase. Any questions there? And I could do like a demand decrease in the product market, or maybe a supply increase in the market. And kind of know, okay, that's going to change my price. And then because my price changes, that's going to shift my demand curve for labor. Okay. Any questions on anything there? Okay with that? All right. Okay, so we've got a unionization question here. So suppose that fast food workers are able to unionize, right? This would result in what happened to the equilibrium wages and what happened to the number of workers who were employed. Okay? So we'll kind of review how these unions work. So if I've got a union, we said it's very similar to a what? Yeah, monopoly, right? Because the workers are supplying the labor. So if they're unionizing, they're the only ones selling this product, which is labor for whatever the circular labor market is. So relative to when we have no union, when we have a union, they're going to make decisions based off of a twice as steep, and it's not really necessarily marginal revenue. We can think about like a twice as steep marginal benefit to everyone in the union. I guess if you wanted to, it still kind of does represent dollars. So we could think about it as revenue, right? They know that then where that marginal revenue curve hits the supply curve, which reflects workers' marginal costs, this is the quantity of labor that the union would set. And I forgot to earlier identify, just without a union, where our quantity of labor would be. At this quantity, they know that companies would be willing to pay whatever that worker's value of the marginal product of their labor is, right? Or the point of the demand curve for labor. So with a union, we get higher wages, but a smaller number of equilibrium workers, right? So I don't know, go back to that problem. It's, having a union would lead to higher wages, but also a smaller number of workers. Now, some other things that a union results in would be what? Right? Compared to the perfectly competitive equilibrium, we now are losing out on all this surplus. Right? An additional thing to kind of notice, this is kind of backwards, but once we have a union, where would, so I'll identify this first. Where would consumer surplus be? Well, that would be the area under the demand curve, but above the price. Here, the price is wage, right? Wage is the price for labor. So notice consumer surplus relative to when we had kind of no union, it would have been this entire triangle. Our consumer surplus also went down, right? So we saw kind of consumer surplus decrease. Producer surplus, right, would be the area under the wage, but above the supply curve relative to this area in equilibrium. So we see producer surplus go up, consumer surplus go down, and we have, some positive value now. We have some amount of deadweight loss. Right? But here, remember, consumers, who are the consumers of labor? The consumers of labor are the companies, right? So when I have a union, right, workers come together, they're able to decrease the company's surplus, those consumers of labor, and the producers now are the ones supplying the labor. Those are the workers. So the workers' surplus goes up, company's surplus goes down. However, right, for those who stay in the union, things are great, right? Wages are higher. But for some people, right, they would now become unemployed. Okay? And that would be kind of the people in this deadweight loss. Okay? Any questions on that one? So the problem specifically just asked about comparing wages and the number of workers. But it may be a good thing to know that with a union, there is some deadweight loss. Kind of see a lower consumer surplus and higher producer surplus. So if we go back here, right, wages increase, but we have a fewer number of workers. What about monopsony power? So here, which of the following would not be true about monopsony power? Well, let's just review a monopsony. Monopsony. So a monopsony was what? Unions are when we had one supplier of labor. Monopsony power were like if you had a town that only had one employer and nothing was in driving distance. So I imagine if you go up to Alaska, there's actually some pretty good examples of like monopsony power going on, because there's probably only one major employer in an area. And if you want to do that job, you work there or you move, right? You leave. So if I have monopsony power, this was when instead of a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, well, now it's the consumers who have the power, or here the consumers are the companies. So they're going to actually base decisions off a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve, right? They're the ones who have to pay for labor. So they're going to try to keep the cost or the expenses low. So that twice as steep marginal expenditure curve, which remember, supply curve represented the marginal cost of workers. So I'm basing my marginal expenditures off of that. Well, now we can kind of think about demand always represents the marginal benefit. It's just that the marginal benefit to companies is that value of the workers' productivity of labor. So they'll set the quantity where this marginal expenditure curve hits this demand curve. That's the quantity that the monopsonist will choose relative to if the market was in equilibrium. It would just be where supply is equal to demand. So we'll kind of call this Q1. So after we see monopsony power, there's a fewer number of workers, but because they have monopsony power, the company, there's only one now, can say, well, I know workers would be willing to supply their labor for whatever this lower wage is at that specific quantity of labor. So my monopsonist wage relative to the wage without a monopsonist would now also be lower. So monopoly led to higher wages for the workers, but a lower number of them. And monopsony power would lead to still a lower number of workers being employed, but also a lower wage. Okay? Just like with a monopoly, we now, as a result of this power, have deadweight loss, right? Some value of deadweight loss here. But now let's kind of think about what happened to producer and consumer surpluses as well. I don't know if this is in the problem, but just to kind of be complete. So now consumer surplus, it would have been, I'm going to use a different color. It would have been the area under the demand curve, but above the price. Well, now the price of labor is wage. So this was consumer surplus before, this triangle up here. After we have monopsony power, well, now the wage is all the way down here. So producer surplus is going to be all of this. Okay. Generally, the amount of surplus they gain will make up for what they lost. So we see that producer surplus, consumer surplus actually increases with monopsony power, which makes sense. The consumers are the companies. So if there's only one company and they have this monopsony power, they can increase their surplus, but for the producer surplus, it's going to be the area under the price, but above the supply curve. So notice before, without monopsony power, it would have been this entire triangle. So we see producer surplus goes down, and we already said we have some positive amount of deadweight loss. So there, I probably went through more, right? But if we have monopsony power, well, we're going to have some deadweight loss. So deadweight loss can't be zero. So that can't be true. The equilibrium wage paid to workers is higher. That's not going to be true. We said it was going to be lower here. The equilibrium number of workers will be lower. Well, that one's true, right? And consumers of labor will set wages. So that one's going to be, wait, I confused myself. So wages are going to be higher. No. Okay, there's two. I think did I open these from, I think I put this back up on here and didn't update it. So let's double check that I changed this for the ones that I gave you. This is the one that I had on my drive here. Which is not true. So there's actually two correct answers here. Right, so this one, I thought I changed it. I thought I updated the file, but this is a good time to go through it since that file has been up there for a while. So if I'm thinking about which of these are not true, right? Well, deadweight loss is zero is not true, right? We definitely have some positive amount of deadweight loss. The equilibrium wages will be higher. Well, no, in fact, they're going to be lower. Right? So those first two are not true. So there's two correct answers to this one. The equilibrium number of workers will be lower. Well, that one we said that is true, right? And consumers of labor will set the wages. Well, yeah, the consumer of labor was the company, right? There was one employer, but they're the one who are consuming labor. So the consumers kind of set that wage based off of what that optimal quantity they chose was going to be. Okay. So there, those first two, both of them would be considered correct. Right? If we're looking for what's not true. Excuse me. Yeah, I think I thought I updated and replaced the file, but apparently I did not. So I'll probably put up a little announcement that just kind of notes that for problem 6, really A and B would be considered correct because both of those are not true. Any questions on anything here with union power and monopsonies? And I wouldn't go as far as kind of giving you, what if both of them exist? I think we worked through something like that in class, but we'll kind of single it out, right? Either I'll ask you a question where there's only monopoly power, or a question, sorry, when I say monopoly power, where there's only a union, or a problem where there's only monopsony power. Any questions for you here? All right. I don't believe there's a problem on here. Let me double check. I don't think there is. No. So I'm going to add it in. What's going to be a result if we have kind of a minimum wage? All right, so I want to review that here. Let's say we had a labor market and so it was currently in equilibrium. So it starts out kind of here. Okay. And then the government comes in and sets a minimum wage. So what's going to happen? Well, an effective minimum wage would mean that it's set above whatever the current wage is, right? If I set a minimum wage down here, well, I'm not, I'm paying my workers more than that already, so nothing changes. So let's say they set a higher minimum wage. Well, the new equilibrium wage is going to go up if it's an effective minimum wage. However, at that higher kind of cost for labor, the consumers of labor, those who are demanding kind of workers, they aren't going to hire anyone who has a value that's less than that wage now. So all these workers here, the value of those workers to the firm is less than the cost that they would have to pay them. So they no longer hire them. And they only hire up to that point where the wage is exactly equal to that value of the marginal productivity of labor. So all these workers, right, are now unemployed, right? No company is going to hire them. And we have all this deadweight loss that exists. Okay. So the minimum wage, although it increases the wage for the workers who keep their job, it decreases the number of workers we see in that industry. Okay. So it's good for those who keep their job, not so good for the people that it causes to become unemployed. Any questions on that? Yeah. Okay, good question. Yeah, so before, producer surplus would have been the area under the wage, right, or under the price, but above the supply curve. However, after this change, the price is now up here, right? So my new kind of producer surplus is going to be this entire area. So even though I lost out a little bit, I use, I'm not drawing these very well to scale, but I'm losing out a little bit, like a sliver of a triangle. I'm gaining a much larger rectangle. Producer surplus is going to go up. Now, remember, producers here are the workers. So that makes sense. A minimum wage is put into place. It does benefit workers. Now, it benefits the workers who keep their job, hurts those who don't. But overall, we would say workers kind of net positive there. Producer surplus. For consumers, before it was the area under the demand curve, but above the price. Here, the price is wages. Right? So it was this entire triangle before, but after the minimum wage, the area under demand, but above that price of labor or above the wage is going to be much, much smaller, right? So with a minimum wage, the consumers of labor, the companies, are hurt. Well, that makes sense. They're paying more, right? And then, of course, we have some deadweight loss that's going to exist from this intervention as well, or this regulation. Okay. Any other questions on this? That's all I wanted to say there, but just kind of review that minimum wage model. And, I'm not going to be showing you necessarily a picture of all these graphs. I might be asking you a question. And I think, for every question, you should be able to usually draw some type of a graph to kind of understand what's going to be happening. Okay? At least in terms of these labor market ones. Okay? And really the externality ones as well. The ones that you wouldn't really have kind of a graph per se to draw is, let's say I gave you this 10-person economy, and I then asked, okay, what percent of total income is controlled by that top 20% or that top quintile? Well, the top 20% of income earners, if I've got 10 people, what would 10% of 10 be? Well, 10% of 10 would be 1. So if I want the top 20%, that would be the top 2 people. Yeah. So I'm going to look for who has the 2 highest incomes. It looks like it's the last 2 people down here. So the top 20% or the top 2 people are earning what, $155,000. Right? So how do I come up with like what percent they own? All I'm going to do is take their income, divide it by the total income in the economy, and then because I want it in percentage form, I'm going to multiply by 100 or move the decimal point 2 places. So to get that total income, I'm just going to add up all of these income values here. I think if I do this, so it's going to be what? 37, 47, 55, 60, 90, 130, 200, 50, should be 400,000. Right? So if I add up all these values, I should get 400,000. Okay? I'm not trying to make this tough. So like on the exam to save time or just to make it a little easier, I could actually, everything here is just zeros. So I could just add all these up. I would get 400 and then just remember, oh yeah, I left off the 3 zeros. Or I could just go through and, you know, plug all of them in my calculator. So I got 155,000 over that total times 100 would give me the percent of income that those top 2 people are making. Right? I think if I get this entered into my calculator, I think it's around what, 30 something percent? 38.75, I think is what you'll get. Okay. Questions on that? Okay. Maybe what I'd ask you to do instead is maybe do the bottom 20%. Then you would just take the people with the 2 lowest incomes and right, kind of figure out what percent of the total income they're making. And remember, the reason why we did this was because if we did this for every quintile, we could then kind of plot these points and get our Lorenz curve. So our Lorenz curve told us something about the inequality that existed in an area. So we were thinking about the percent of the population on our x-axis and the percent of income owned on the y-axis. We said that if everybody was paid the exact same amount of money, well, then the bottom 20% would own 20% of the wealth. If I then looked at the bottom 40%, they'd own 40% of the wealth, so on and so forth, right? Because everybody is getting paid exactly the same. So this kind of 45-degree line, you almost think about this was like our line of, I should call this perfect equality, right? And then it stopped up here at, if I'm looking at 100% of the population, what percent of the wealth does 100% of the population own? Well, 100%, right? I mean, I've looked at everybody. So we then plotted what our city would look like, right? So we came up with what is our bottom 20% of income earners own. Plotted that point, bottom 40%, 60, 80, and then 100, 100. So we had kind of our city or our economy's Lorenz curve, okay? So the Genie coefficient, we said, was basically the relative size of our Lorenz curve, right, to this line of perfect equality. So we would have taken the area under our Lorenz curve, right, and divided that by the total area under this line of perfect equality. So this was going to be what we call kind of this Genie coefficient. Oops. So what's the highest Genie coefficient I could see? Well, let's say I had a Lorenz curve that was like all the way, so that it exactly was like a right, you know, kind of a 90-degree angle here. Well, then the area under that Lorenz curve, if it was exactly this right angle, would be what? Or 90-degree angle, would just be 0, right? So if I had 0 and then over whatever that area ends up being, right, which 100 times 100 divided by, or sorry, multiplied by 1/2 would always be kind of this area of 500, but we don't have to know that. All we have to know is that, well, if I had a kind of this 90-degree angle, that represents like nobody owns any of the wealth except for the very last person, right? So this would be like if I had a perfect, it was like perfect inequality, all right? Where I had the most unequal kind of distribution of income, okay? So if I see this Genie coefficient of 0, right, that's telling me that I have like the most inequality. But what if my Lorenz curve gets closer and closer to it eventually as this line of perfect equality? Well, then the area under my curve would be exactly the same as the area under that line of perfect equality. So a Genie coefficient of 1 is kind of the most equal economy. Okay? So as I get closer to 1, that Gini coefficient, it's telling me that the economy is more equitable, or kind of have more income equality. As it gets closer and closer to 0, it's telling me that my income equality is getting worse and worse, right? So here, what statements are going to be not true? An economy with perfect equality has that Gini coefficient of 1. We said that was true. The closer the coefficient gets to 0, the more inequality exists. So that one's also going to be true, right? The closer we get to 0, the more inequality that exists. An economy with perfect inequality has a Gini coefficient of 0. That one is also going to be true. And then the closer that coefficient gets to 1, the more inequality that exists. Well, no, actually, the closer it gets to 1, the more equality exists, right? So the one that's not true there would be that last one, or D. So kind of make sure you know that a Gini coefficient of 0 is telling you that it's a very, inequitable society. A Gini coefficient of 1, that's the most equal. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Where are we at in time? We're about done. So one more thing. This short answer, what it's really getting at, so it's talking about older and younger workers. So let's say that older workers have higher education or maybe more technical skills, right? What would that do to wage differentials between these two groups? Okay. So we talked a little bit about this kind of even with like the discrimination, that if we have human capital or like skill acquisition that varies across groups, that could cause wage disparities. So let's say that we have old and young workers, right? And I think the problem even tells you, assume that you have the same supply for both. And then you have the demand for old workers, right? But remember, the demand curve for labor is the price of the good times the marginal productivity of labor, right? Well, here, if we're looking at old and young workers producing the same good, but we know that for younger workers, they have more human capital, right? Or have increased their skills more than the older workers here, that the demand curve for younger workers would then be higher, right? So we could do things like compare the number of old workers to young workers in this industry, and also kind of what we would expect in terms of the wages paid, right? So if we have one group like young workers here that have higher skill or human capital acquisition, the wages for that group are going to be higher, and we would expect to see a higher number of those workers employed. Okay? So I could give you kind of an example like this too, where there's something that causes marginal productivity of labor differences between groups or based off a certain characteristic. What would that tell us about kind of the, if we're looking at the data, what that wage gap would be? Questions on this? So that should get us through all those problems. Make sure you review those. I would also try to, like I said, go back, use those homework to kind of practice problems and kind of just refresh your memory on a lot of this material. Once you do that, go back through the lectures, kind of look at kind of the completed version of the slides that will be in that old lecture folder, and look at anything that kind of had eye-clicker questions that we kind of used. Other than that, if you're going through any materials and you have questions, feel free to email me. Fairly free tomorrow, so if you want to schedule a time that's going to meet, send me an email. We can probably set something up that'll work. I think that's it on my end. So unless there's any other questions from me, I'll see you guys Wednesday at noon in this classroom. Also, I think I said it Friday, but one last plea. You guys have it. If you don't mind getting on doing those evaluations, I greatly appreciate it. I think they're open till the end of the day today. Other than that, thanks for the semester. I hope we'll kind of end things on a positive note here. I want everybody to do as well as they can in the final. So if you got questions, reach out, and good luck for the rest of your studying.
Will you be able to send out an email?